In these times of uncertainty, it's all the more important that we keep collaborating, informing, and inspiring each other, so that we can be smarter and better tomorrow. Welcome to the Pakhuis de Zwijger livecast.
Hello everyone, on behalf of Pakhuis de Zwijger, welcome to the livecast about emerging stories. My name is Rut Kronenburg and I'm your host of today. This is the 19th edition of Emerging Stories, the talk show about the importance and future of independent journalism. Especially during these very crazy and uncertain times, access to reliable information is even more important than ever. In this series, we're going to dive into the different aspects of journalism. We touch upon the problems and we try to come up with solutions. And we do that with international guests, with photographers, with media experts, with journalists, with scientists. They share with us their emerging stories and the future of journalism. Today we're going to talk about the safety of journalists. Because, as we all know, the attacks on journalists are increasing worldwide. And we're going to talk about this today with my guests. In the studio, we have with us Jos Bartman, political scientist. Welcome.
Thank you.
And via Zoom, we have with us Rebecca Vincent. She's Director of International Campaigns of Reporters Without Borders. Rebecca, welcome. And later on, we're also going to talk with Vlad Borisovich. He's a photographer from Belarus. Jos, hello.
Hi.
How are you today?
I'm doing good, definitely, yes.
And you just recently finished your PhD on political science. What was the research about? You don't have to go very deep in it because we're going to talk about it later as well.
To basically put it into layman's words, it was about why and how journalists are repressed by subnational governments. And I looked specifically in two contexts, namely the state of Veracruz in Mexico and the state of Gujarat in India. So it was really about why and how local political elites benefit from suppressing these type of actors.
And then especially journalists?
Journalists, but more generally also information bearers. Oftentimes I interviewed journalists. Specifically in the context of Mexico, I happen to have met many local journalists writing about corruption and so on and so forth. But I selected them on the basis of the type of information that they wrote about. So you have journalists that write about sports, of course, but it's about the people that try to address corruption, human rights violations, embezzlement, and so on and so forth. These are often journalists, but can be activists, for example, as well.
Including bloggers, etc.
Bloggers, right-to-information activists, whistleblowers, you name it, yeah.
And why especially this topic?
Subnational regimes, I think, are understudied. We tend to look at national governments when we look at repression.
So when you say subnational, what do you then...
The state, in this case. In a country like Mexico or India...
Which is a federal country?
Exactly. These are federations, and their subnational governments have a tremendous amount of power. They have a lot of autonomy. Sometimes they have their own constitution. They are responsible for law and order, keeping law and order. And they have the means to repress. And actually, at the moment, these are large decentralized countries that combine both democratic and autocratic institutions, authoritarian institutions, are really among the most dangerous places for journalists to work in. And therefore, I sought to understand how it works and why they are targeted specifically.
Interesting. We're going to learn about it a little bit more later on. Rebecca, how are you? You're in London at the moment, right?
Yes, newly in lockdown again here.
Same as us here in the Netherlands. You're the director of international campaigns at Reporters Without Borders. What does your job entail?
Well, I'm responsible for strategizing and implementing RSF. If I say RSF, it's because we're known internationally by our French acronym, Reporters Sans Frontières.
Right.
I'm responsible for strategizing and implementing our key campaigns of international significance. And I also retain responsibility for our UK bureau, which is the job I was doing the first 3 years I worked for RSF as well.
Okay, and what is the project you're working on at the moment?
We've got, at least half a dozen big campaigns. I've most recently been very active on the US elections. We were calling on all candidates to sign a press freedom pact there. We champion, press freedom around the world. We're looking now at the G20 Riyadh summit and campaigning for reforms in the run-up to that. And we work on a number of emblematic cases, such as the assassination of Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta, the killing of Jamal Khashoggi in the consulate of Saudi Arabia in Istanbul. We work to free Julian Assange, who's currently detained in the UK, awaiting possible extradition to the United States. We're trying to stop, similar Maria Ressa from being arrested in the Philippines, and a few other campaigns.
Right. And why did you choose this profession, or was it a kind of an accidental thing?
A very long story short. I started my career as a diplomat, actually, for the State Department. I'm originally American, although I'm British now too. I worked for the State Department for about 3.5 years, and the post I did 2 years at the embassy in Baku, and then a temporary assignment at the US mission to the UN in New York. We're very human rights focused. And another long story short, I ended up, for personal reasons, leaving the State Department, moving to London, doing my master's in human rights, and then I started working for NGOs and have done human rights campaigns ever since. I've worked really heavily on free expression, but also on other human rights issues, and I've now been with Reporters Without Borders for just over 4 years.
Okay, so from a diplomat to an activist, more or less. Do you like it? Like it better?
I love it. And in fact, it was very useful to understand the inner workings of government, and it helps me in the advocacy work that I do with states. But this is a much better fit for me. I love being able to focus just on our issues. I understand that diplomats have a role to play in balancing other areas of bilateral and multilateral relationships, but right. I'm able to focus on the values that are important to me. So it's been very rewarding, I have to say, personally.
Good, thank you for sharing. In a bit later, we're going to dive deeper into the subject, but first we want to know what the people on the street are thinking about this specific topic. So our flying reporter went to the street and asked passers-by what they think about this question. Journalists are increasingly being attacked worldwide. Is that a risk of the profession that they have to take into account? Let's have a look.
Zeker niet het risico van het vak. Een journalist moet zich vrij kunnen uiten en moet zeker verslag kunnen doen van wat er in een land gebeurt. Dat vind ik. En de mensen worden niet aangevallen te worden en überhaupt vermoord te worden.
Nee, zo zou men niet met elkaar om moeten gaan. Absoluut niet. Dat hoort niet bij het vak.
I have actually worked in this field, and there is in many countries, like I'm from Iceland, and we have issues there that, for example, if you're a whistleblower and you have to work with a journalist, you're not really protected. And some journalists even have to go to have to defend themselves in courts. And they are simply just reporting the news, and that's not a good situation.
Nou, ik vind het heel raar, want journalisten doen gewoon hun werk en dan hoeven ze daarvoor niet aangevallen te worden.
Ik vind het niet het risico van het vak. Ik vind het verschrikkelijk dat het gebeurt, want dat tast de persvrijheid aan en onze inzichten in wat er in een land gebeurt. Dus nee, dat gaat veel verder. Dat moet gewoon aangepakt worden.
Nou, ik denk niet dat het per se juist is dat journalisten per se in elkaar geslagen worden. Maar ja, als journalist ga je wel een beetje, stop je wel een beetje je neus in andermans business. Dus soms kan het gebeuren. Misschien is het inderdaad wel een beetje een risico van het vak, maar lijkt me niet echt heel juist.
Nee, ik vind niet het risico van het vak. Ik vind het echt... Mensen die dat doen, die moeten ze op een eiland zetten. Ik vind het schandalig. En niet alleen de journalisten, maar politie, ambulance. Je moet met je handen van een ander afblijven.
Nou, ik vind wel dat er vrijheid voor moet komen, weet je wel. Want het is natuurlijk hartstikke belangrijk dat er journalistiek is in de wereld, zodat het volk natuurlijk al het hele verhaal te weten komt. Dus ja, het is het risico van het vak als in, ja, het is risico, maar het zou niet zo moeten zijn, vind ik.
I think in general we agree. Rebecca, what are your thoughts when you see these vox pops?
I mean, very clearly people think it's wrong for journalists to be attacked for doing their jobs. I was just thinking to myself how a similar conversation would go on the streets of London.
Yeah, and very interesting.
It would be interesting. I think if you put it in terms of violence like that, most people would agree that journalists shouldn't be attacked for their jobs. But if you talk about press freedom, in some countries, it's not necessarily as popular to defend. And that was a thought I was having about in the UK context. If we talked about press freedom on the streets like that, I think you would get some hostile comments about media too, which is, I think, a result of some of the behaviors of governments here in recent years.
Okay, and Jos, what do you think when you see these comments?
Of course, agreed with almost everybody there on the street. Obviously, I think journalists need to be protected and should be able to report about things of public interest freely. I mean, an attack on them is an attack on a person, but also an attack on democracy in a way, on the freedom of people to be informed about issues of public interest. So should they? And perhaps, of course, there are journalists that go to the front lines and are hit by crossfire, of course, and that's maybe a risk. But I don't think that that's the general trend. I think the general trend is that journalists are attacked for what they write and not for where they stand. So.
And what do you think if we ask the people on the street in Mexico what they would answer?
It's a good question. I think that there's a general idea in Mexico that journalists should be able to report about things of public interest. So I think that you should get a similar story. One nuance perhaps is that in Mexico you have a lot of envelope journalism. So not all journalism is good journalism, and I've heard.
And when you say envelope journalism, you mean that they're paid to make a story?
To write flattering reports about public officials, for example, and that type of journalism that's not very much liked, of course.
And it's not a kind of journalism we're talking about when we say independent journalism. We talk about the safety of journalists, and often then we talk about the murders, the journalists who are murdered. But safety is far more than that. And UNESCO actually made a kind of a video about this. Let's have a look at that as well.
We realized corruption was centralized. Now it's a free-for-all, serious corruption.
ต้องมีกระบวนการต้องใช้ว่ามันเป็นกระบวนการค้ามนุษย์กระบวนการค้าคน
Calling for urgent action to address the human rights crisis.
لا يوجد ناخبين أصلا، لا يوجد ناخبين ومانعين الناخبين من الدخول.
And now they want to continue upending environmental laws.
Comment être serein quand on sait qu'il y a des policiers qui se manquent et qui ne sont pas sanctionnés?
The press is under a lot of attacks from all sorts of quarters.
She's a journalist! Stop her!
It has nothing to do with immorality. I'm just a journalist wearing jeans and t-shirt.
Maintenant, nous faisons face à des intimidations physiques.
Mi esposo lo agarraron con otros 4 muchachos viniendo a una reunión del M19 aquí en Matagalpa.
Je me dis que le gouvernement n'est pas là pour emprisonner les journalistes.
Journalists have to report fairly and independently, but it's extremely difficult when so many of them are being killed.
Mais on sait que demain, après-demain, ça peut être toi.
UNESCO. Rebecca, maybe you can enlighten us about this as well. What is RSF actually doing against impunity?
Sure. Well, we have found similar trends as what we've just seen highlighted in the video there. That statistic at the end, that 9 out of 10 killings of journalists remain unsolved. Not just unsolved, a great many of those cases don't even undergo proper investigations. We've tallied nearly 1,000 cases of journalists killed over the past decade, nearly all with full or partial impunity. And it's worth noting partial impunity is still impunity. So one measure that we're advocating that we think would help significantly globally is we're calling for the establishment of a UN special representative on the safety of journalists. Now, this would be a specific mandate looking at safety of journalists. There are other, parts of the UN that have responsibility for free expression, but this would look specifically at that crucial issue of safety of journalists and ensure effective follow-up of existing UN mechanisms, ensure that somebody is there as a sort of protector of journalists to make the international system work. So just recently, on the 2nd of November, which of course is the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists, we called specifically on the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres to live up to what he promised to RSF at the start of his term. He's got just over a year left in his first term, at least, as Secretary General. And he indicated to us that he would make this happen, but that it might take time. And so far, he hasn't concretely taken steps to appoint this mandate, because this mandate would be a representative of the Secretary General. So we're now calling on him to make that a priority, to make sure that, we don't know if he'll have another term or not, but he has a little over a year now to make sure that his legacy is one of action to concretely address, this serious issue of killings of journalists with impunity, rather than a legacy of inaction and just bureaucracy.
Right. But we also have a special rapporteur on the freedom of expression. How do you see them? Should there be also a special rapporteur on the safety of journalists cooperating together?
We think they would cooperate quite well, and it's worth noting it's different mechanisms. So a special rapporteur is a different sort of institution than a special representative, because this would be a representative of...
Sorry, yes.
But we collaborate with whoever the mandate holder is, and in fact that's just changed, so it's now Irene Khan, who's relatively new in office. We always do collaborate closely with that mandate, but it's very broad. Free expression entails many things. It's digital rights, it's sort of, artistic free expression of elections, many areas outside of the sort of more journalistic focus of free expression, let alone safety of journalists. And again, when you look at the fact that nearly 1,000 journalists have been killed in the past decade, it's clear that the UN is not doing enough. And so we think that more is better. And this is not any sort of criticism of any of the previous mandate holders, but the nature of that mandate is just not enough to allow sufficient focus on safety in particular.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Jos, so you're researched on the effects of the subnations, as you call it, and the repression on information barriers. Can you come on? Why do you think that these people or the subnations actually want to suppress journalists and media workers, so to say?
Yeah, one thing I think is good to state is that often in a case like Mexico or in a case like India, I mean, we have democracy on the national level, but we have basically sort of like authoritarian local political elites. And these often work together with organized crime groups or other non-state actors. And they benefit from keeping information inside the state. And you have to imagine that in the case of Veracruz, for example, there was a community of critical journalists trying to report about corruption of back then the governor Duarte and about human rights violations, etc., etc. And sort of my idea, the idea that I got from doing fieldwork there is that what makes it so dangerous is that these subnational political elites that are authoritarian, when information comes out about their corruption, they can be punished by central institutions. For example,
by the federal government.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So while these are in power for sometimes decades after decades, these local political elites, when there is a follow the money type of story coming out, basically published in the capital, for example, these leaders are under threat. So that's one big reason for them to repress journalists.
Right. And what ways do they use?
It's a whole plethora of attacks. And I think the one thing that is important to say here is that In my cases, it was pretty bloody. Veracruz was among the most dangerous places to work in the entire world. I think under Governor Duarte, I think about 10 journalists were killed.
In what year?
Basically within 8 years.
Because Mexico is, according to the UNESCO report, one of the deadliest countries for journalists, right?
Right. And Veracruz was one of the deadliest places in Mexico. There's subnational variation. And this government was particularly hostile towards journalists. And just to answer your question, I think it's indeed really good to realize that repression is often incremental. We count bodies often because it's very concrete type of attack and action that we can turf. But the people that were killed there have had received a whole plethora of attacks before, including threats, harassment, online attacks, various types of online attacks, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm. And you actually brought a video with you, right?
Yeah, maybe we can have a look. Indeed,
is that possible? Let's see.
Bueno, soy Jorge Sánchez, hijo de Moisés Sánchez, el periodista asesinado en 2 de enero del 2015. Él desde muy joven pues, se interesó por la cuestión del activismo social, por la cuestión de informar. Pues usaba todas las herramientas que tenía a su mano. Una de ellas era el periódico, La Unión.
Las noticias del Ayuntamiento de Medellín aquí en Semanario Informativo La Unión. Próximamente.
La Unión nace a raíz de Moisés Sánchez para difundir las historias que no se difunden en los medios de comunicación cooptados por el sistema. Es el periodismo que debería de existir y el periodismo ideal, ese periodismo apegado a la gente. Es un medio que nosotros estamos usando como bandera. Creo que nadie de nosotros estudió periodismo para cubrir a las muertes de sus compañeros, ¿no?
So what is the status about this particular case?
I mean, the governor is not there anymore. There has been a transition in power, so that's good news. But the main person in the clip, for example, the photojournalist that you just saw, I spoke to him in 2015 when this clip was also shot. And he fled Mexico after one of his friends, Ruben Espinosa, was murdered also in 2015. So what you really have to imagine is that it was such a bloody period where so many journalists were killed.
Right.
It also had the effect of basically displacing their colleagues. They fled because they didn't dare to stay in Veracruz.
And is there still an investigation going on, or?
I think the case of Ruben Espinosa is basically closed. There are people in prison. However, there are suggestions that the people that are in prison have been scapegoated, basically. And the current status of the father of this man, Moisés Sánchez, I think it's also a closed case, actually. Yeah.
Meaning that the people who are behind bars or not?
No, okay. Absolutely not. No, that rarely happens, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Investigations are often botched. Most cases are not even legally addressed. And when they are legally addressed, the investigations are of doubtful, genuinity, so to say.
Right.
Yeah.
That is also something that you experience, Rebecca. That investigations either do not continue or are not satisfaction.
I mean, sometimes there's not even investigations launched properly at all. But yes, when we talk about impunity, it includes these cases where the investigations don't lead anywhere or they don't lead all the way to the masterminds. That's very common too. Even in cases where we do see some prosecutions, very often the masterminds behind these horrific attacks walk free. So that is something we're working hard to address.
Yeah, like in the case of Jan Cusack of Slovakia. I mean, the mastermind is free, right? He was not convicted.
Well, that case has been really disappointing because Slovakia actually had every opportunity to
address
see it through. And it's one that we've pointed to often because, of course, Jan Kuciak being killed in the heart of the EU shortly after a prior killing of a journalist in similar circumstances in Malta, Daphne Caruana Galizia. There was huge attention on it, and it's something that we pointed to in our advocacy work with the Maltese government. At a time, it looked like Slovakia was moving forward properly, right? The investigation was moving faster. The judicial process seems to be more robust than what we've seen in Malta. So this is very disappointing now, the outcome that we've seen, where ultimately impunity has been allowed to reign in that case as well.
Right. And talking about the case of Daphne Caruana, what's the status about that? I mean, there was a kind of news that one of the defense lawyers offered some cash money. Can you, how does this will affect the trial?
Well, this case, so I'm always of two minds about this case because from one perspective, the campaign for justice has been incredible. A big group of NGOs, including RSF, have worked closely with Daphne's family. Meanwhile, investigative reporting has continued and a legal case. All of these things have been moving forward. And in some ways, we have seen tremendous progress, but none of it has come easy. And one thing about Malta is that every time there is any sort of progress, the second that the international community sort of shifts attention elsewhere, we also see regression. And so we can point to things that, you know, we're very positive to achieve. From an advocacy perspective, the fact that there's now an independent and impartial public inquiry continuing, that was very hard to secure. The Maltese government had no indication of wanting to accept this. It was only through a really hard slog at the international level, particularly with the Council of Europe, that we were able to get that established. But now the current government, the Prime Minister now has attempted to interfere with it. And so there's always these sorts of things. In terms of the murder case itself, there were 3 suspected hitmen detained just under 3 months after Daphne was killed. So they've been in detention since December 2017, but not yet brought to trial. Last year, there were more shocking developments when an alleged mastermind, Jorgen Fenech, was detained trying to leave the country on a yacht. He remains in detention now. The compilation of evidence continues against him. His lawyers are trying to argue that that he's kind of being scapegoated. But there is a very compelling case against him, and it is our hope that is seen through properly. There was a self-confessed middleman as well, Melvin Toma, who was detained and who was given a pardon in exchange for testimony. Now, the last time I was in the country, I'm usually there quite often, but this has been an unusual year with lockdown.
Yes,
I was able to go.
Unable to travel, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, but this year I was able to go. Malta was briefly put on the UK's travel exemptions list in July. So I went to the country because there had been so many developments. And whilst I was there, Melvin Toma actually turned up with his throat slit and a serious set of injuries that have been attributed to being self-inflicted, but that are unusual in nature. And just there's always these kinds of things in Malta. So there's never a dull moment in this case. And one thing that I always stress is, although there are positive examples, and when I speak in particular to local activists and journalists still working for justice in Malta, I do try to be encouraging because the international community is on their side. But I also know that the second we become complacent, the second that we kind of shift focus, and I mean as the international community, from what's happening there, we will just see more backtracking. So it is really important to see it through. But I do believe, as a campaigner, I believe that we are getting somewhere. And I do believe that this is a case that we could see justice served. And if we do, that will have a knock-on impact in actively protecting journalists, not just in Malta, but elsewhere. It will send an important signal that you can't, that those who wish to commit acts of violence to silence critical journalism cannot do so with no consequences.
No, let's hope for a good outcome then. We'll talk about this more later. First, we're going to switch to another guest coming from Minsk, Belarus, photographer Vlad Borisevich. Every week we're going to invite an international photographer to join us here in the series, and they will give us their view on the future of journalism in the form of photographs. Vlad, welcome.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. How's the situation at the moment in Belarus?
Yesterday we have a lot of detainments. More than 1,000 people were captured by the police. So it's quite, I hate to say this, but this is quite a typical situation for 3 months, because we have faked elections in August, and our president Lukashenko trying to get his 5th period of ruling the country. So we just, it was the first time in the history of Belarus when people were not happy with his plans.
Right. So these protests are going on for weeks now. I mean, the perseverance of the people is admirable. So 1,000 people were detained yesterday. Just how many people were on the streets then? An estimate?
Yeah, I can estimate maybe 30,000-40,000. It's not so big crowd, because we have crowds of more than 1,000 people. I think sometimes it even hit at peak at near the 200,000 people, because we all have in Minsk 2,000,000 people, and it's quite impressive, because no one expects that. And it's the usual way, because we ruling like a police country, and there are a lot of police. And yesterday I seen that they changed their tactics, and they invited all the police from the region, so they were absolutely everywhere.
Right.
So they have the force to make a detainment on 1,000 people possible.
Right. And are you still able to perform your job then?
Sure. It's the main task we have to do, because if not we, so there will be no one to filter the information. But we actually more depend, and we depend heavily now on the content from our users and our readers, and they became our, quite of decentralized attention network. It helped us a lot.
Okay, so we're going to have a look at your story on the demonstrations. Can you tell something about it while we'll have a look at the pictures? So this is yes. Lukashenko, I assume?
Yes, it was the picture of Mr. Lukashenko on the day of election, and we managed to shoot him in the right time. I was the first time in his photographer's team. It called like journalist pool, and I misbehaved a little, because I started to shoot in time when it wasn't allowed. But it gets me the verbal aggression from one of rulers of this journalist school. But at least I have the photo of Mr. Lukashenko, not so happy, uplifting, and as a way as I see him, and as a way as a lot of people see him. So he quite dramatic here, because of the location where other people were not allowed to shoot, but I managed to shoot him a little. So it's not so, yeah. And this one, it's a picture about the protests. They usually happen on Sundays, and the crowd were a little bit more aggressive than usual, because they were I don't know why, but they just they behave in this way. And it was the moment before these guys from left became spreading tear gas, and they do it a little time to time. Not so bad as they do it in Hong Kong, but people in Belarus not so used to it. Yes, it was. It's the main event of every Sunday protest. There's a lot of police people, and you see a lot of them don't use the uniform, and they are not telling who they are. They just use the normal outfit of usual people, but they tend to use their masks, And you see on the background is the people from inner army. They just happen to manage the protest. They don't involve as much, but when the people became a little more violent, they usually use the violence too. But the man who is capturing this girl is from OMON. It's so-called special department of police who conduct special operations. And you see the special operation is to capture peaceful protesters. And in that exact one event, they took, I think, that more than 200 people in one injustice.
Right. And do they use violence as well when they arrest these people?
Yes, time to time. But when they see that you capture them and the buttons are pressed, they became different persons. But time to time, they tend to be who they are. And the way that they were teach to behave with people, you know, that they actually teach. They were teach to behave with bad persons, not persons who are absolutely peaceful, and they do extra job and keep people very angry and without they don't know even why there is so much violence to them.
Okay. And this is another picture of a demonstration.
Yes, it was happened on the same day because those days are different. Some are rough, and some are not so rough. And it was definitely a rough day. And you see a lot of people who are adult persons. They are just saving themselves when trying to get on the rooftops of this car cooperative. And I have a lot of OMON behind me, and I have just a few seconds to shoot because I have not quite, but a fast camera. And, when you experience these situations, your brain became shutting down all the extra information. And for me, the marker is auditory exclusion. It's it's a marker when you see that it became very quiet and you don't know why. And if I feel that it became very quiet, it's different that my subconscious kind of mind shooting down all the information and preparing me for extra fast leaving the situation. And as I see that I became a little bit without hearing, then I just take photos and run.
Right.
Yes, and this is the photo we take from our office. It happened to be near this event, and there are a lot of policemen who are trying to detain a person in a car. And it's the moment when he ran away. I mean, drive away, and he even made the police turn, like in Hollywood blockbusters. But I don't know what he felt, what he feel then, because it was absolutely extraordinary event for everyone who saw it, and we've seen a lot. And we just managed to shut down all the lightnings in our office because we were the only one who were working at the time. It was at night, and we turn on all the cameras we have and start to film it. And we just have the evidence, because not his car, but a few or three. Three more cars were broken down by the police because in the act of brutality, they don't know what to do and know how to act. And they just started crushing everything, and they just ran away, and we filmed everything we have. And now we have the proof of what happened.
Right. And did you broadcast it as well, or is it on the internet? No?
Broadcasting is not the way, absolutely forbidden, because, if you broadcast something in live, it will be like you're organizing the protests. So you have to have a little pause with the event. So you won't be captured by the police as an organizer. So we have to manage a little time lag between the event and the
broadcasting itself.
Yes. Broadcasting.
Yeah. What do you? Here's another picture. Yeah. People running.
Yes, one more picture of people who are escaping the police, and that they're absolutely peaceful. They don't tend to fight with them. They just tend to go away or keep the distance. And it's the moment when they started to use water cannons, and you see the water is orange because they marked it with some dew, which will be on your clothes, and it will be easy to find and identify you if they would like. But actually, they don't do it because they don't have the right equipment to screen you. And they usually tend to capture people when they pursuing them from two sides. You see the only one side they're capturing from behind, and they also manage to drive near the crowd from the left. You can see it. You cannot see it, but they are there. But it was easy for me because I have some time to shoot, and it was because the district where all of this happening is where I put where I was a child, so I knew everything there, and I know the natural drift lines of people, and I know where to go and what to do to be a little bit from safe, not in a distance from event, but safe.
Yeah, right. How do you see the future for Belarus?
I see it absolutely bright because it was a main shift of ideology in people, and they even didn't know that there are a lot of them who are thinking the same. We just keep to be maybe 5 years ahead of our government, so they a little bit stuck in the old times, and they just didn't happen to realize it, and they use old methods of gaining trust, and it's not working now.
But do you think that in the end Lukashenko will step down?
Absolutely, it's just a question of time because he not feel a safe ruler. He not untrustworthy, and a lot of other words. It won't. It is simply isn't possible for Belarusian people who are very peaceful to manage him. Just not the way.
So I hope that you will be right on this. We hope all together with you. Thank you so much for sharing these pictures and your story with us. I wish you all the best. Stay safe, especially as a photographer. Thank you. Then we go back to our main topic of today. How can we keep journalists safe? Do you have any thoughts on that, Jos?
And it's very difficult, of course, because ultimately everything needs to happen within the countries where these journalists are actually under threat. So solutions ultimately need to be domestic, I think. But there are some ways to, of course, put pressure on governments to end impunity. I think one of the problems of journalist killings is the fact that rarely there are good, proper, effective, thorough investigations into these murders. And by engaging in advocacy, I think there can be made progress when it comes to putting prosecutors under pressure to investigate these cases. But in the case of Mexico, there has been, in 2010, there has been a federal prosecutor responsible for crimes against journalists installed. As far as I know, that's the only country that has such a system. I'm also an advocate of that specific system because...
But did it work? Because Mexico is still one of the deadliest countries.
Progress never goes that fast. It didn't prosecute a single case up till very recently. So it has been seen as a very limited success. But there is a little bit of hope. And of course, we have to make small steps. I think that's just the nature of this work. And I think that generally speaking, in a context of Mexico and in some other contexts as well, especially these decentralized contexts, I think it could help because local investigations and local courts are often easier to corrupt than central institutions. So while maybe it's perhaps a small contribution, I think it could actually contribute.
Rebecca, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, of course, you are striving together with RSF on a special representative for safety of journalists. Who do you think ultimately would be responsible then?
Well, that's just one of many ways that we're trying to end impunity. I have to say, I think that there is a significant role to be played internationally, and that's because although, yes, things have to happen on the ground, I think at the heart of most cases of impunity is a question of political will. And the fact that many states lack the political will to effectively address these issues of violence against journalists. And not just the states in where these acts are committed, but our own states, our own democracies lack political will to actually make safety of journalists and press freedom more broadly a central issue really in their bilateral and multilateral relationships. And so that's something that we can chip away at from abroad. We can impose costs in other ways to sort of up the political ante, because pressure in many instances will then lead to many other steps being taken that will result in a safer situation for journalists everywhere. And I want to note as well that the issue of safety of journalists is not just something that's a concern in sort of faraway places that we used to think of in that way. Our data at Reporters Without Borders is showing that actually increasingly journalists are being deliberately targeted. These are very often investigative journalists that are working to expose corruption and other risky topics. And less often at the moment in terms of global trends are we seeing as many journalists killed in conflict zones in countries that are meant to be at war. So Jos, I find it interesting where you focused on in your research, because both Mexico and India are examples of the deadliest countries that are not meant to be at war, right? And so the nature of threats against journalists is changing, and we need to keep up. But when we allow impunity in even established democracies, that sends a signal that it's okay everywhere. And so that's one reason I campaign so much in these cases within the EU, because Europe has the strongest protections for press freedom of any region in the world. And when this can happen here, it really can happen anywhere. So we have to address these issues, I think, with our own governments, and then get our governments to then raise it as an issue of greater priority with their partners in places that are maybe performing worse.
Maybe for Rebecca, just a question about journalists and attacks on journalists in Mexico and India. As you rightfully state, that these are among the most dangerous countries for journalists, and I think that sometimes there is even underreporting when it comes to these attacks, because sometimes, I mean, as you said rightfully, I think it's a specific small group of journalists that is often attacked, namely investigative journalists. These are people, they're not journalists that write about tennis or hockey or something. But at the same time, there are other types of actors that fulfill basically the role of journalists, but do not work for an investigative magazine, so to say. So these are right to information activists or other types of information bearers that actually are very much connected when it comes to the work that they do to investigative journalists. How do you deal with that sort of conceptual distinction in your work and when it comes to advocacy? Do you take a very broad concept of what a journalist is, or I'm just curious about that?
Well, in our work, we include citizen journalists, and not all press freedom organizations do. Some only tally cases of the killings of professional journalists. We include professional journalists, citizen journalists, and media workers as well. So when we talk about this figure, 1,000 cases over the past 10 years, that includes all three categories. But on our website, you can see our barometer of press freedom violations. It breaks it down so you can see each category, you can see each country, and track that over time. Because we agree, I think, as the nature of journalism changes, the nature of threats to journalists change, and I think we really have to look at why somebody has been targeted. Because, of course, that applies even to a professional journalist. We verify in every case that we include in our list that we believe fully that they were targeted for their journalism, not for other reasons. That applies to imprisonment as well, I should note. So yes, I think states have been a little slower to wake up to that. Possibly they see the category of citizen journalists as harder to define, and it's true, it is harder to define. But in many places where I think the places with the worst press freedom climate, sometimes there are so few professional journalists that citizens are stepping in and fulfilling a role that ideally would be played by more professional journalists, and we have to look at how to protect them as well. I think Mexico, I can think of examples of cases we've included on our list in the past of there was somebody we considered a citizen journalist who had posted a video on Facebook exposing local corruption and was quickly killed. We see these sorts of things in other countries as well. In Mexico, it's worth noting this year, there have been fewer killings of journalists than usual, in part because of the lockdown affecting many countries. But Mexico is bucking that trend. There have been, so globally, we only at the moment have tracked 33 cases of journalists killed in 2020 around the world. 5 of those cases have been in Mexico. So this violence there shows no signs of abating.
No. Yeah.
Yeah, and no, just to add, I think that about the decrease in numbers when it comes to attacks on journalists, I think that's also, perhaps good to mention that in a state like Veracruz, which was so bloody, there were so many people that fled, so many journalists that eventually fled. And I asked myself the question, if it's the case...
Not only the state, but also the country, you mean?
Even the country, yeah. They fled to Chile or Argentina. That really happened. Mm-hmm. And I wonder whether if there would be a decrease when it comes to attacks on journalists, whether that would be an indication of the fact that it's safer, or whether it would be an indication of the fact that there is just such a state of fear in the country that journalists even write less articles. So a decrease in number when it comes to attacks is not an increase in safety immediately. No. I think that's important to mention.
Sure.
It's very important to mention. And when we look at the press freedom climate in countries, we assess a range of indicators. So we also put out the World Press Freedom Index, which your viewers may know. The countries at the very bottom of the index have such a repressed climate that you don't see many cases of killings and arrests and that sort of thing anymore, because simply the institutions aren't there. So I'm thinking at the very bottom now, we've got North Korea, Turkmenistan, Eritrea is always at the bottom, and they do have journalists imprisoned in Eritrea, but often there's not really any movement there because things are so repressed. So it is important to note that it's only one indicator. And of course, the results of sort of historical violence and impunity, as well as this chilling effect that we often talk about in free expression, that self-censorship becomes widespread. And there are fewer people then willing to toe the line, so then fewer acts of retribution against those people. So it's worth bearing in mind the broader climate, not just physical attacks that we see manifest in some places.
True. Rebecca, do you also see a silver line in all this? Are there countries who actually really work on this to fight against impunity?
Well, there's countries that, have always performed a bit better than others. The Scandinavian countries are always very high up on our index. There are a few declining democracies that we speak of at the moment that we work on a lot because we have to hold our own governments to account. So this is countries like the UK, like the US, and others that have been deteriorating in recent years. But each year, I have to say, when our World Press Freedom comes out, it's always really interesting to look at the analysis that goes with that, because there are always a few stories of countries who massively improve. And when you look at why, that's also a question of political will. So political will is not just, the question of the reason for impunity, but it's also the means in which we address these issues. So it's usually countries where there's been a change in government or another significant political step, and they then follow it up with immediate action. So
can you give an example?
Yeah, we'll have to see the action to follow this. But just 2 weeks ago, some of my colleagues were in Somalia and secured a commitment from the Prime Minister and the President there to put a moratorium on the imprisonment of journalists in Somalia. Last year, we saw massive improvements in, I think, Malaysia, in Sudan has started to come up the ranks. The year before, Armenia, following a revolution there, had improved quite significantly. There's always several success stories. The year before, I'm now thinking South Korea was quite a good success story. So those examples exist, and I try to point those out sometimes when we're discussing things with more hostile governments, that it doesn't have to be that way, that there are examples of this. And I think the message to sitting governments should be, if they don't eventually reform, the situation is not tenable in many places to last forever, and eventually people will push back. And I think allowing reforms in the first instance is always I think very, very welcome. So we're interested. I was following Vlad's comments with interest too. We're all watching Belarus and how things
totally, yeah, we're following it closely.
That could be an example of Lukashenko's forced out, and to then see that the improvements that will follow in press freedom in other areas.
So there are silver lines. That is very hopeful. What are your thoughts on this, Jos?
totally agree with Rebecca. There are silver linings, and I think it's a matter for NGOs to look at these windows of opportunity where they can jump in. Another point is, of course, where NGOs, I think, can help is to support the families of victims that try to still gain justice when it comes to their murdered journalist family members.
Right.
I think here NGOs can play a big role when it comes to funding, for example, these processes. These are often very expensive, very unsafe processes themselves to address these murders legally. So I think,
right.
yeah.
Actually, that is a kind of a project you're working on right now, right?
That is definitely true. I work for the Safer World for the Truth project, and we try to deal with impunity by monitoring certain investigations in the world when it comes to journalist killings. Yeah.
It's a project in cooperation also with RSF, right?
Definitely,
Free Press Unlimited,
yeah,
RSF, and CPJ.
They're a partner, yeah.
Yeah. Rebecca, can I then ask you, are you optimistic about the future and about the safety of journalists?
I have to be optimistic in my campaigning, but I'm also cynical. So if I'm looking realistically at the pattern of things, it's, everything that we've worked on year after year seems to get a bit worse. It is very worth pursuing this sort of work regardless, because there are individual cases that we can help in. And I think without the preventive impact of campaigning, I think the situation that we'd be looking at globally would be far worse. But I think there are some rays of hope. I think many of us feel hopeful now with we believe the election of Joe Biden in the US, because the US has been such an example of even a democracy can slip. Under President Trump, we saw violence against journalists in the US that was unprecedented. Of course, the massacre of journalists in the Capitol Gazette newsroom. This year alone, more than 880 aggressions against journalists covering protests in the US.
Unbelievable.
These became a reality in the country of the First Amendment. So I think now, if things change politically there, I think that will also in turn send a signal of hope to other places, that we don't necessarily have to continue to follow this downward trajectory. If the United States can reverse its performance. They're currently 45th out of 180 countries in our World Press Freedom Index. I think there's other countries that then might feel the pressure to do so as well. And so if our democracies can do better at holding themselves to account, that will set a better example everywhere else, and we'll have more of a strong footing in terms of holding others to account as well. So yes, I'm optimistic, and I hope it's not a scenario where it has to get worse for it to get better, because we've certainly seen what I hope is the worst in recent years.
Mm-hmm. Jos, you as a political scientist, what are your hopes for the future?
I hope exactly the same as Rebecca, and I think that definitely there are possibilities for it to become sort of a better situation. At the same time, I also think that there is unfortunately a generation of authoritarian leaders worldwide that has developed new tools to undermine media and deal relatively well with elections. So authoritarian leaders nowadays rarely sort of completely steal or abolish elections, but they manage them by manipulating media and attacking journalists. I think that's a general trend.
You also refer to the US at the moment.
I mean, definitely, as Rebecca said, there has been an increase when it comes to attacks on journalists, even in the United States. So I also agree that, of course, with the win of Joe Biden, that might inspire anti-authoritarian movements worldwide. But I'm trying to also pinpoint that, for example, leaders in the Philippines, India with Narendra Modi, these are all democracies that have good functioning institutions when it comes to elections, but they know quite well how to suppress the free flow of information. So there's a lot of hard work to be done, I think.
Well, if you, I'm asking you, how do you see the media landscape in 30 years from now?
Whew, wow, that's a really difficult question.
I
ask
all my guests these questions.
And that's this is where I'm a little bit pessimistic, and that maybe is a bit different from the attacks on journalists, but I'm afraid it will polarize a little bit more, and that is something that worries me. If you look at, for example, the win of Biden after the election, what I'm worried about is, of course, we're beating our chest that Joe Biden had won the election, but at the same time, there are so many people that voted for Trump. Why I was unable myself to see that covered when it comes to the media that I watch. So the BBC is so outspoken when it comes to their criticism towards Trump, and I completely agree with them. But it also symbolizes the polarization of media, and I think that can also blow back in a way. So that's something we definitely need to understand better.
But this is even this year, not even in 30 years.
Yeah.
We have to round up, so sorry for that, because we can talk about this topic for hours. So thank you very much for joining us. Rebecca, thank you for being with us. Jos, thank you also for coming to the studio. My viewers, of course, thank you for watching this 19th episode of Emerging Stories, the talk show about the future of journalism. Next week, we will be back with a new episode, and then we're going to talk about influencers, youth, and journalism. Also a very good topic, I think. So tune in next week. And Pakhuis de Zwijger has a lot more livecasts about different kind of subjects. If you want to know what, have a look at their website for the program. Thank you for now, and have a good evening.